Welcome to the Fort Collins Fellows Podcast, from Colorado State University to New Belgium Brewery, and the hundreds of miles of hiking and biking trails. Fort Collins has earned its well-deserved reputation as one of the top places to live in the United States. Join the fellows as they uncover the stories, places, and people that make Fort Collins so extraordinary.
Well, if you are in and around Fort Collins, you know that there's been a lot of discussions over the last couple of years about how the future of Fort Collins might look, by way of planning and zoning and building and development. And we're lucky enough today to have kind of an expert on that side of things that might have a great insights into what Fort Collins might look like, how it might develop, and things of that nature. So, Clay, I appreciate you joining us today on Fort Collins Fellas.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome, Clay. Great to have you here. I got a bunch of different areas of the town I want to ask you about. What's going on? No, just
I'd say you're going to really test my knowledge, so this will be interesting.
I literally right before we got started, I wrote down. I was like, "There's this half-built lot behind Dairy Queen. I'm going to ask Clay about that."
Well, talk to bring us down to a kindergarten level about what the planning manager for City of Fort Collins does.
What the planning manager does is oversees a few different departments within the city. One is our development review planner. So these are the people that are reviewing new development against our standards in the land use code. We also too have an environmental planning team, and they have a section in land use code as well dedicated to natural habitat buffer zones and protecting other natural features within our community as well. We also too have our long range planning team that's responsible for keeping up things like city plan, which is our comprehensive plan and our vision for how our community will develop over the next 30, 40 years. And we also too have sub-area plans within the community for different parts of the city that have special considerations. So good example of something that our long-range planning team has been working on for the past few years has been the East Mulberry Corridor Annexation Plan, which recently went to City Council, went last week, and received a 7-0 approval from City Council, and we'll go back for second reading next week. So long-range planning is more working at that sort of long-range, again, vision level for our community and then different parts of our community. And then we also have our zoning department that is going out and inspecting new development and making sure that the development was constructed per the plans that we've approved. And so they do a lot of stuff on the compliance side. But they also too process smaller development applications like minor amendments, that kind of thing. So planning manager oversees all those groups. And so our responsibility is making sure that we have a vision for our community and that we're working with our community to develop that vision, and then making sure that new development fits in that vision as much as possible. Obviously, there's a lot of things that our land use code allows, and there's just a lot, and people have lots of different ideas for what they want to do with their property. And so our goal is to make sure that new development and that kind of thing fits in with what people expect and what our long-term vision for our community is.
I think Fort Collins, and I've talked about this with a ton of people, specifically, and I don't want to throw Loveland under the bus by any means, but I think one of the things Fort Collins has done an absolute phenomenal job on is city planning. It just seems very well thought out. You've got industrial in its own little section. You've got commercial corridors along 287, Harmony Corridor. You've got our residential, these kind of 15-minute neighborhoods that you guys are really focusing on. And it's just well planned. And then you drive through a community like Loveland that's been around for, just as long. And you've got a commercial building next to a residential, next to an industrial warehouse, it feels. And it just feels kind of like mismatched together. And like you said, vision for Fort Collins seems to have been very well thought out for many, many years. And now you've taken the reins because you've been in the position for about a year. Is that right?
Yeah. So I started in this position in March.
So a little under a year, right in the wheelhouse of all the fun stuff that's happening with the land use code. And I'm sure just totally smooth sailing for you the last 8 months, huh?
Yeah, it's been a lot going on for sure. And I will say, I think the land use code topic has been more controversial than I think what we would have expected. And at the same time, we're always dealing with tough stuff. Because we're dealing with these really complex systems that, and also two issues that don't have easy solutions. So, I mean, our land use code discussion has fundamentally been about housing and trying to make sure that Fort Collins is a more affordable place. And our housing market and system is very complex. And, what we do at the local level with respect to our land use code and zoning and that kind of thing can certainly influence that. It's not going to solve our housing issues by itself. And so I think that's why these conversations are so challenging, is that we're dealing with these systems that are much greater than the city of Fort Collins. Our housing market doesn't just end at city limits, and I think this housing issue is a topic of concern for every growing community, prosperous community. I would argue probably globally. It's not just a US issue. And so I think that's where these conversations get to be really tricky, is trying to understand what we can actually do and what's realistic and what we can promise our community members with respect to influencing these systems that are so much bigger than just our city.
Yeah, I mean, the housing thing is so interesting. I mean, obviously, Patrick and I work in the housing sector here, real estate and mortgages, but I remember my parents grew up outside San Francisco. They didn't grow up. They lived outside San Francisco and Atherton, which now is just this insane community that everything's worth millions of dollars. But back in the day, they could have bought a house for $60,000 or $70,000. I mean, I just don't understand. I mean, people love Fort Collins. It's a great town, and people are moving here. And people moving here that have money, and the affordable housing thing. It just seems like a problem that's just really hard to solve. And it's like, how does it not turn into like a Boulder community where everything is, so expensive? And then I just, not to play devil's advocate, but it is a hard problem to fix. And it just seems like eventually the home values are not going to go down in the long run. I mean, they maybe, peak a little bit here, but it just kind of ties into like, I got a couple of questions about like the North College development. Clay, I was reading, you guys have, I've read an article that said something, you guys have, you're hoping to have 23 million that'll be by 2030 for projects and everything like that. Is that money being used for affordable housing? Or like, I guess, what is the conversations in the background like sound like to you in terms of solving this problem? Because to me, it just seems like it's just tough. Like I as much as I want to get everybody into homes and everybody, have a low mortgage payment, the reality, like you said, is much different than that.
What we've tried to do is look at other communities and understand other communities that try to address this particular issue.
Yeah.
And I think what's also challenging, especially in the US, is I don't think that there's a very good case study for Fort Collins. I mean, there's, like Houston is a classic example. This is a city that has very low levels of regulation with respect to land use. And as far as like a major metropolitan area is concerned, it is pretty affordable.
They're just property taxes in Texas are crazy.
I mean, property taxes are high, certainly.
Yeah.
But, also too, commute times are high. And so when we're talking about, we want to be a 15-minute city where people can live, work, and play in their neighborhood, or, they can reasonably find a job within a 15-minute bike ride or walk of where they live. There's very few communities that can say that while also providing housing options for the entire income spectrum.
Right.
Or what one thing we looked at when we updated our comprehensive plan in 2019 is we looked at communities and how well they performed with respect to like economic development and economic health, quality of life, and housing affordability. And there's lots of communities that do one really well. There are very few that do two of those things well, and there's none that do all three well. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to do all three. And there's not a model for that.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create something in a system that can work as well as what we can reasonably expect here in Fort Collins. But I think that's what's hard is we don't have a place that we can look to and say, yeah, this is what success looks like.
So Clay, I just have a brand new neighbor. He just bought a house right next to us and we just met him for the first time. He works for Google down in Boulder.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And he goes, yeah, it's great. He goes, but I go, so you drive to Boulder every day? He goes, no. He goes, I take the bus, the Max line down to Boulder. And I was like, what? I mean, I had no idea that you could do that. And it made me think you look at some of these intersections, whether it's like Harmony and I-25, I mean, they just cars everywhere. It almost feels like, if there was some sort of mass transit system, I mean, Colorado is just basically north and south, east and west. It's kind of a big grid. And you're able to create transportation outlets, hey, whether it's Wellington or further out east, and you had people kind of come and work in town. I'm just kind of spitballing ideas here, but I was kind of surprised to hear that our neighbor who lives right on College and Prospect takes the bus down to Boulder and works every day. And I thought it was great. I mean, I was like, wow, that is awesome to hear. And I mean, and it made me think he can't afford to buy a place in Boulder. He was telling me, because I can't afford to buy a place in Boulder, but I was able to find a place in Fort Collins and still solve the transportation problem, which I thought was fascinating. And you just don't hear that too often.
Yeah, it's called the Flex is the name of
the Flex. That's right. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
And I have a friend, funnily enough, that is in school at CU Boulder and commutes from Fort Collins to Boulder almost every day.
Yeah.
On the Flex. And yeah, you can do it. And I certainly think that regional transit options and that kind of thing have to be part of the conversation. There's Absolutely. Been a long discussion about what rail service might look like between Denver and northern Colorado. And so we'll see how those conversations continue to progress. And with that as well, there is a certain level of people and transit users that you need to make those systems make sense. And we just don't have that in most parts of Colorado, not just in Fort Collins. And then without getting too far down the transit planning rabbit hole, it's just transit service it's not a moneymaker. It's not even a break-even type of prospect.
Yeah.
I think for a long time, the only transit system in the US that was in the black was New York City's. And even that system, I think, because of all the deferred maintenance they have, I mean, they have billions of dollars of work they have to do in a lot of the tunnels and things like that. Even that system's no longer, I don't think that system's profitable anymore either. And I have to double check. I mean,
what do they do in Europe?
Well, yeah. And then the European model would be great. I hear people talk about the bullet train in Japan. And, the important piece of background context there is, when they did the Shinkansen in Japan, it almost bankrupted the entire country because it was so expensive to build.
That's it. Yeah.
And so, it's like these investments in the future can bring with it a lot of risk. And I think going back to one of the previous points is having that vision is really critical. And it then requires, a lot of thoughtful, planning and resource management over, decades.
Right.
And, and I think that's very, very difficult for a lot.
We were joking. The new I-25 up north is great. And I was like, my wife and I are like, it'd be cool. It's just a high-speed train right down the middle here, but obviously
I appreciate your guys' I was talking with somebody today about climate. And, it's one of those things where climate scientists, if you really you can get extremely depressed about it because it just feels like an overwhelming burden and project to take on, which is also kind of the conversation we're having right now about affordable housing. But it sounds like you guys are kind of attacking that head on and trying to, from all different prongs and not just saying, it's, Fort Collins, it's going to be expensive. It's always going to be expensive and it's going to, screw it. Let's just let it live out its life. But no, it's let's think about this in different ways and how we can approach this. Speaking about vision, do you guys, with the growth of Fort Collins, where do you guys see, the city of Fort Collins as far as affordable housing and options and opportunities with the city of being involved, Housing Catalyst, all those different public-private partnerships that you guys have?
I mean, ideally, our goal is to have 10% of our housing stock deed restricted and affordable by 2040. We are trying to implement these updates to our land use code that would provide more incentives to deliver affordable housing and get us compliant with Proposition 123. And, the important thing there is that, Proposition 123 provides more funding resources for communities that have an affordable housing target and are meeting those targets. And so if we're able to tap into those funds, we're able to then help support more affordable housing projects in our community because Housing Catalyst and others have lots of ideas and plans for potential affordable housing communities. And I think the biggest barrier there is just the financial resources. And so, that's why we put that property tax measure on the ballot that did not pass in November. And, we've also too been talking about getting a rental registration program and taking a look at our occupancy regulations. And, we've been trying to have this housing discussion from pretty much every angle that we can think of. And then similarly with addressing climate change, same sort of thing. That's why the sales tax initiative was on the ballot, was partly to fund climate mitigation measures and that kind of thing. We also have a really strong climate action plan, Our Climate Future, where we're trying to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. And, obviously have a really strong partnership with a Platte River Power Authority to try and electrify our grid, which will be a pretty substantial achievement if we're able to get that on all renewable energy sources. And we're on track to do that. I don't know what the date is now. That it's kind of a moving target a little bit, but been working with them a lot on that. But then the next step is looking at our building stock, because I think about a quarter of our emissions comes from heating and cooling buildings, and then another quarter comes from just people driving their cars and utilizing vehicles that consume fossil fuels. And so I think that connection between density, 15-minute neighborhoods, transit service, all those kinds of things are all really well aligned with our vision of trying to become carbon neutral by 2050. And so I think that means it means a couple of things. Is one, I think we have to think about our individual choices and what we do a little bit differently. And I think we also too have to put these systems in place that make those decisions make sense for people. And I think that we have to try to combat, to the extent that we can, just continuing to grow outwards and really trying to focus our efforts on getting more services closer to where people live and getting people to live closer to where services exist and that kind of thing. And then with the building component of things as well, we're going through a process right now to update our building code, and we continue to implement measures to require more energy efficiency in new construction and for new building projects for existing buildings as well, to try and attack that as well. So we're doing so much stuff to try and address this housing issue, but then also too is also in direct support of our climate future and our climate action work. So it's all this kind of sort of systems level thinking and systems level change that we're trying to work on. That takes a long time and is very challenging, but ultimately, if we're successful, I think will be pretty amazing.
Patrick, it made me think of Thrive Homes. So there's a builder, Thrive, that is like a carbon neutral builder. Clay, you're nodding your head. You know them?
Yep. I don't know them personally, of course, but I'm familiar with their work and all of that. Yeah.
But would the city team up with a builder like that? Be like, hey, we want to work with you. You guys are doing carbon neutral new construction.
Let's say that we had a city owned piece of property and we were looking to do something with it that would involve housing, certainly. I think that would be a potential option. And I think you had a question about North College earlier, and so that might actually be a good segue, because you're asking about what our plan is up in that corridor, and you were referencing some numbers related to our urban renewal authority that's up.
Yeah, the URA, the 23 million that they're going to use on projects. I think they're buying the Albertsons up there.
Yeah. So just for a little bit of background there, just for listeners that aren't familiar with
please.
Urban renewal authorities and all of that, the purpose of an urban renewal authority is per state statute to remediate blight. And blight can be lots of things and is a pretty loaded term. But I think in general, what it means from the statutory perspective is buildings that are a little bit run down. You might have a part of town that has inadequate infrastructure to service new development, might have bad streets or really funky layouts of lots. And so they could use a little bit of financial support to spur redevelopment in these key corridors. And so back in 2004, we implemented an urban renewal plan area up in North College. So basically from Vine Drive all the way up to the Larimer and Weld Canal, just north of the King Supers. Yeah. And then it goes to the east over to Redwood, and on the west it's a little bit weird, but it basically is just sort of maybe about a quarter mile west of College Avenue is sort of an easy way to think about it, because the boundary gets a little bit irregular. But yeah, what you can do in those urban rural plan areas is you can utilize a portion of property tax money to reinvest in redevelopment in the corridor. And the theory behind it is basically what you do is you take a look at how much property tax that plan area is generating day one, and anything above and beyond that increment for that plan area, you can reinvest in these redevelopment projects. And for a period of 25 years. And then after that, the money goes back to the taxing entities that would go to normally. So those are entities like Poudre School District, the county, the health district, there's a pest control district, a lot of different people that collect or entities that collect property tax.
Man, they're waiting for that 25 years to go away and be like, man, we just got a huge raise.
Yeah. And so that's the theory is that, for a period of time, like those entities receive a little bit less money in those areas than what they normally would. But at the end, they'll be generating a lot more money because there's been a lot of development in that corridor. And so, yeah.
How is that different like in opportunity zones? Are you familiar with?
Yeah. Opportunity zones are a little bit different because those are defined at the federal level.
Okay.
And those are for census tracts that, and like the goal for opportunity zones is to try and get, redevelopment in corridors that could use a little bit of help. And so they're generally looking at census tracts that are lower income than like the city that they're within, and trying to provide business opportunities and things like that in those zones.
And because I think it was either the prior administration or this. Anyways, like you can go online and see where opportunity zones are located. There's a few in Fort Collins. And for those of you who don't know, you can look it up. But basically, you put in money to create affordable housing. And then if you don't do anything for 10 years, you then can sell it. And there's like no tax hit to you or anything like that. So the incentive is to keep the money invested for 10 years. I'm probably doing a terrible job of explaining an opportunity zone. You can go into all the weeds with it, but I've seen those around. I was just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we actually, I think two of the opportunity zone census tracts are in the North College corridor.
Yeah. One by Vine, I want to say just north of Vine.
Yeah. So one runs basically from College Avenue all the way out to I-25 between Mulberry and Vine. Okay. Like that general area. And then there's another census tract that's north of Vine, and then College to the Larimer Weld Canal. And then I forget the eastern boundary.
Is anybody doing anything with those? Or are they just no?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. I think nationwide it was kind of a flop.
That was like a hot topic for maybe a couple of weeks, and everybody's like, "Nah, we're over it."
The only thing that works is like 1031 money, and anyways, and then you still have to dump. You have to double its value or whatever it was. But
there's a bunch of
regardless. Well, I want to jump into something, that is, as of today, I believe the Preserve Fort Collins has to submit all of their signatures by today. Is that correct?
That's correct.
By what time? Today is October, for those, this will be about a couple months out, but it's November 28th. Is it today at a certain time? Is it, or have they already been submitted? Where are we at with that?
I haven't heard if they've already submitted today. I believe it's by noon. I'd have to double check the exact time today, but yeah, today's the deadline.
So let's say hypothetically they get the amount of signatures. Where do you see City of Fort Collins moving from here? Because it's kind of like we're at two strikes, so to speak. And I really agreed with what Rebecca said a year ago when we interviewed her of, this isn't in my opinion, I agree where you are, where you're at, but not a citizen initiative. It's way too complex that's why, I voted against Proposition HH. And the reason I did is because I couldn't explain it in 2 sentences. It was so complicated, so convoluted that take from Peter to pay Paul. I was like, if I can't understand it and I'm in it on a daily basis, definitely not voting for it. But I feel like the city, the land use code is so complicated that your average citizen and I don't want to discount the average citizen, but your average citizen reads the blue book that gets sent out to them, reads a paragraph and votes one way or another about something that hasn't been changed in 1997, just isn't the right way to go about it. But clearly there's enough pushback from a group, Preserve Fort Collins, saying it's the wool has been pulled over our eyes, whatever you want to call it, but might go back to city council for repeal or to the vote here again shortly. Where do you see it kind of going from here?
I think it's tough to say because ultimately city council will make that call and how to navigate that. If they get enough signatures, if Preserve Fort Collins gets enough signatures, I believe we have penciled in a city council meeting later this year to talk about what those options look like.
Mm-hmm.
Because one option would be you put the entire ordinance to the ballot. And I would agree 100% with what Rebecca said. I mean, trying to vote on something that complicated, I don't think is a very good idea. And I don't think that many people, even people that would consider themselves experts in real estate or passionate about city planning and real estate, would have the time to not only just like read the land use code, but really understand what it does.
Yeah.
In all of these different scenarios. And so I think that I don't think that would be a very good idea, but that would be city council's prerogative, whatever they want to do there. We've also thought about different ideas, trying to strip out the controversial pieces and understanding what those are, and maybe put that package to a ballot if council wanted to do that. Then there's I'm sure there will be other options that emerge, but ultimately that's what we would need to talk to city council about, all these various options, and work with our attorneys to make sure that that is in line with what the petition campaign would be able to accomplish if they get enough signatures. And so, yeah, it's a mess.
Well,
really
it's interesting too how Fort Collins voted on November 7th. It was a pretty progressive vote for the city. And, I would say, if it were to be I was thinking in my head, man, if I was Preserve Fort Collins and I saw how this vote turned out, I would almost pull back and say, hey, 40% because it was a 40% turnout, or was it 30% for the vote? Do you remember?
I don't.
But I think it was actually pretty decent comparatively to other communities. And
Mayor Arndt was saying sometimes it's below 20, or it's crazy low, some of these turnouts.
But it was a good turnout. It was 30 to 40% or something like that. And I'm like, man, if I was Preserve Fort Collins, I'd almost pull the reins, because I'm like, hey, if it does go to a vote, Fort Collins is clearly voting a certain type of way, and this is something interesting. But that's, I guess, a conversation for another day. But it's very cool to see such a huge plan that's trying to be put into place with such huge implications. Don't get me wrong. I mean, definitely the layout of Fort Collins could change the kind of the views of it, but also a little bit think it's a nothing burger for 99% of the public, because the amount of money that it would cost to build an ADU. I think there's a lot of things that are getting excited about over potentially nothing. But regardless, I think it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Patrick, you and I spent time talking to all these all these people that are involved in the city and everything like that, and you and I are still we're not 100% sure what they're doing. So you can only imagine what the person just down the street who hasn't been paying any attention, just their eyes gloss over, and it's no, I'm not even going to attempt to understand what's going on.
But you talked about getting involved with the planning and zoning and things of that nature, and these projects and subplan areas. Talk to me a little bit kind of at the Sanctuary at the Greens, where that has had a citizen-led initiative that ultimately went to kind of our, I believe, county attorney or city attorney or court, and got pushed back saying, hey, we didn't follow the sub area plan. We have to take that into account. And talk to us a little bit about kind of the Ziegler Crossing, where these citizens are kind of getting involved and how they can get involved if they disagree with the something that's going through city planning.
Yeah. So I think for both of those particular projects, as with everything, the devil's in the details. So Sanctuary on the Green, what happened there is, it's proposed development out Taft Hill and the port, basically, for some townhomes, single family, detached homes. And yes, there's a group of community members that live out there that think that it's not compliant with the sub-area plan that's in effect for that part of the community, called the Northwest Sub-Area Plan. And it ended up going to city council on appeal and then to district court on appeal thereafter. And district court kicked the decision back to the original decision maker, which was a hearing officer. And what the district court decision said is that the hearing officer's decision didn't make it clear how well the plan complied or didn't comply with the Northwest Subarea Plan, and that the hearing officer needed to make a really clear finding related to whether or not the plan complies with the Northwest Subarea Plan, which has then had this kind of ripple effect that, we need to do that for every project if there's a sub-area plan that is in effect for that part of town. So won't spend a lot of time there. And then the other project that you mentioned at Ziegler and Corbett, is really a relic of a previous city council decision, because really the point of contention there is, should a new neighborhood connect with an existing neighborhood with a street? And originally there was supposed to be a Corbett was supposed to continue all the way through to the north to connect with English Ranch. City council made a decision 10, 15 years ago to remove that street connection. And I think then there's this conversation about where there should be a light on Ziegler to service some of the neighborhoods on the east side of Ziegler, and trying to make sure that all these neighborhoods are connected in some way, shape, or form. So fundamentally, it's a question about neighborhood connectivity and whether or not that has value to people, because a lot of people see street connections as just traffic and eroding quality of life and that kind of thing. And really why we have those standards in our land use code is to make sure that people can get to places efficiently, and that there are connections between neighborhoods. So that way, if you need to go to Front Range Village to go pick something up, you don't need to get out onto Ziegler or Harmony or Timberline to get to Front Range Village, that you can get there without having to get on a really major street. And so the way that community members get involved, and they should continue to get involved, is if they think that, well, I don't agree with this vision, or I don't think that this development is meeting the vision of the sub-area plan or city plan or what have you. People have the right and should have the right to make that claim and to make their case. And so it's just all part of a due process, but also two, it's part of just how we build community. I mean, we want to hear from community members what they want to see and what they don't want to see. And I think that the tricky thing is that for a lot of development projects, we hear from a few people, and we send out mailers, generally speaking, to hundreds of people that are within a notification area, usually between 800 and 1,000 feet. And, most times we only see a few people at hearings, which says most people either don't care or they're okay with whatever the developer is proposing. And so I think that's the other thing too, is, we are constantly trying to suss out how representative are these voices of the broader community. And that's kind of the purpose of these broader exercises when we do a sub-area plan update or our comprehensive plan update, is trying to get as representative of a cross-section of the community as what we can to develop our vision and our plans, and then thus our regulations. Because our regulations are really trying to put into code the things that we heard from the community and what matters to our community members. And so I think that's the tricky thing in development, is just trying to understand how representative those voices are, if that makes sense.
Clay, I kind of want to go back to East Mulberry real quick. If you could wave a magic wand, I know you said it just there was a vote that just happened. Timeline: are we going to lose the Waffle House? Are we getting rid of the hotels? What are we doing with East Mulberry, Mr. Planning Manager? Let's. I know a lot of questions on that. Jenny Arndt mentioned it. I saw a quote in Colorado, and she's like, it's kind of a. Well, I don't know what she say, something kind of a crummy front door to the entranceway or something like that. But what's going to happen? We're going to clean it all up?
Long term, I think the idea is that there are some aesthetic improvements and things like that on the gateway. I think in terms of the hotels staying or going, or the Waffle House staying or going, the Waffle House is probably safe.
I hope the Waffle House stays, for the record, just so we're clear. Yeah,
that's good to know. I'll make sure to let the East Mulberry team know that we have one vote for keeping the Waffle House.
Yeah. The last place in my fantasy football league has to spend they have to eat 20 waffles at a Waffle House. So these are important establishments that we need to stay. But no, sorry, go back to I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, this has been I think probably a topic for a couple decades at this point.
It has been. And long term, what we want to make sure is that people who live in the East Mulberry corridor have the same access to city amenities and infrastructure as any other part of the community. And we also, too, want to make sure that different parts of that corridor retain the things that make it special. So I think about the air park. That's a great spot for small businesses, manufacturers, industrial, warehousing, that type of thing. We don't want that to change.
Yeah.
We also want to make sure that those places don't flood like crazy when there's even just like a pretty minor rain event. And so, I think that the challenging thing with Mulberry is, how do we retrofit that area with stormwater infrastructure? How do we bring streets up to standard to where there's curb gutter sidewalk on some of those streets and get it connected with the rest of the community? And then also, too, we also know that there are some properties that are problematic from a policing perspective. So how do we make sure that we clean some of those activities up and that kind of thing? And then that we annex it in such a way that we're not creating this undue financial burden for the city to bring all these things up to standard. And that we're also setting reasonable expectations, because it's going to be very expensive to do all this work. And it's going to be a decades-long project to bring different parts of these corridors and different parts of this corridor into the city and bring it up to city standards as much as what we can. It's going to be very challenging. But I think ultimately it's like, we want to keep the things that make that corridor special and unique. We also want to make sure that people, feel like they have, the same level of service that the rest of our city has as well. And so that's sort of the balancing act.
Right.
Is it true or not? Is it true? I'm probably butchering this number and quote, but if we took that over, like our inbound calls to the police would increase like 50% day one type deal.
I'd have to look at the numbers, but like if we're like talking about like right by the interchange, that's a really high area for call volume to the sheriff's office. And so if the city were to take on responsibility for that area, yes, it would increase the workload for police dramatically, and we'd have to hire new police officers day one for sure. But I don't recall the scale of that off the top of my head. But those are the types of considerations that we have when we're thinking about
this. Might be a stupid question. Where is the barrier there? Is it the river or
so the corridor boundaries roughly is like the shop. So on the west side, it's the shopping center with Walmart.
Okay.
And all of that. So kind of like LeMay and Mulberry.
Yep.
And then it goes up north and roughly runs along like the Vine corridor, but there's been some neighborhoods that have annexed into the city. So thinking about like Mosaic and Bloom and Timbervine, like those are in the city, but a lot of the stuff around there is still in the county. And then on the southern side, south of Mulberry, like the river is probably a good piece of geography to keep in mind when thinking boundary there. And then on the east side, it basically runs up against I-25. And there's some properties on the east side of I-25 that are.
So it does go all the way to I-25. Okay.
Yep.
And high level for those listening, what would be the reasoning to annex these? Like, what's the benefit? What's the kind of cons of annexation? Why is it a part of it? I know it's part of our intergovernmental agreement with like Larimer County that we would do this, but why is that? Why is it important? Like, what does it even do?
The big thing is service provision. So some of the things that you've mentioned, just police calls. So if you're living in the East Mulberry corridor right now, you have a Fort Collins address, you'd expect to pick up the phone and call Fort Collins police and see a Fort Collins police officer. Because they're in the county and not in city limits, it's county sheriff's responsibility. So it creates some of these confusion between who's providing service to whom. And that also goes with utility service. So right now, most of that corridor is in a separate water district and separate sanitation district. So water's kind of simple, but our stormwater utility doesn't serve that area right now, really, because it's not in city limits. Or, same thing with like city light and power, like we're not out there. So right now it's like Poudre Valley REA or Excel that's providing service. And so by annexing, we basically create clearer service provision boundaries for all the service providers. I think that's one of the big ones. Some communities, annexation can also provide a higher tax base. Here it's a little bit more complicated because some of these areas are deficient from an infrastructure perspective. We might have a higher tax base, but we also have a higher cost basis because we need to retrofit that area with infrastructure. So I think that's the other reason why communities annex things. But I think broadly speaking, why we have an intergovernmental agreement with Latimer County is so that way we create clear boundaries for service provision.
Makes sense.
Clay, what is your goal? We're coming up to the end of this. This episode is going to come out kind of, I think, at the beginning of 2024. You personally, as the planning manager of Fort Collins, like what are your goals for the coming year? What's on your desk? Like, what are you looking at? I want to check this off. I want to get going on this for you personally in your job.
I mean, one of the big things, I think getting the land use code stuff sorted out is pretty critical. Because the second phase of our land use code was going to focus on commercial corridors.
Okay.
And I think that's a really important piece of the conversation when we're talking about what our community looks and feels like moving forward. I think we have this vision of being a more urban place that's more walkable. And that's going to mean that some of our commercial corridors will need to change. And so I really want to get to that work because I think it's really important. We also too are doing a lot of work with our water utility and trying to align our work to make sure that our vision for development and things like that is coherent and consistent with the vision of our utility, and making sure that we have adequate natural resources for our community and so for our future. So I think that's more critical work that I'm looking forward to in 2024. And so, I think those are two pretty big ones. And I think also too, working on implementing the Mulberry Corridor Plan, because we do have some developments that are in the hopper that might, create some of our first trigger points, or we call them thresholds in the plan for annexing some of these areas of East Mulberry. And so I think that's going to be more really critical work that I'm looking forward to as well.
Love it. It's so interesting how just complex all this stuff is. You're like, just go fix it. And then they have, hey, well, you got money. We got tax dollars coming in. Go pay for it. So fascinating. Kind of get, taking a peek behind the curtain.
So East Mulberry gets annexed into Fort Collins, and a couple of the fan favorites, Horse and Dragon and Funkworks, become a part of City of Fort Collins, which definitely are great little breweries. But we end each show with the question of, on a Friday afternoon when it's not so snowy or cold, what patio do you find yourself frequenting or enjoying the most to enjoy a Fort Collins brewed beverage?
Oh, Stodgy for sure. It's stumbling distance from home. So
there we go.
An easy one.
Stodgy is a beauty place. That patio is fantastic.
Chris and I were talking, we were doing a kind of a planning session, and we were talking about possibly doing like a live recording from Stodgy, because Stodgy kind of consistently gets named as a favorite, especially because it is like that northwest side of Old Town, like kind of like there's not much, but Stodgy's definitely a game changer over there.
Yeah, it's great. It's a lovely space. And again, for me, it's very, very convenient. So checks all the boxes and good beer. So,
Very cool.
Well, Clay, we're going to have you, as you go through your to-do list for 2024, you got to keep us updated. And we'll have to have you back on as we have, new developments going on in the town and the planning and everything like that. It's fascinating.
Montava ever gets off the ground.
I was going to say Montava. Yeah, real quick. Give us 10 seconds on Montava. Is that going to happen?
Is it going to happen? I think so.
Hey, you heard it here.
I mean, they're in the development review process for their first phase right now and getting pretty close to wrapping that up.
Was it Max Moss? Is that his name, Max? Boy, yep. I felt like I interviewed him like 8 years ago regarding that development, and here we are still. It's
a big project, and he always knew that was going to be a decades-long project, and so I'm looking forward to the first phase.
Cool.
Very cool. Well, Clay, thank you for joining us today, and good luck to you. I know you guys have a lot of things going on, a lot of things on your plate, so good luck, because I know it'll be a challenging year, but I know you'll do great.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thanks, Clay.
All right. See ya.